A continuation from last time. B.F. Skinner, Theory of Language Development. Children require language to operate conditioning. Babies learn to say words when they get positive reinforcement. Children acquire language to operant conditioning. Babies learn words to say words because they get positive reinforcement. Treisman's attenuation theory states that we have an attenuator which decreases the stimulus from the unintended ear. So it goes stimuli, attenuator, perceptual process, and then conscious sensory register. Input from attended ear. When retinal changes conformation, transition will change shape, and initiate flow transition. Adoption will change shape. What is the role of the hypothalamus and limbic? Hypothalamus and limbic system is involved in things like the autonomic nervous system, endocrine system, hunger, sleep, thirst, sex. 3 biases is the confirmation bias, belief perseverance, and overconfidence. Yerkes Dodson law says that it's a bell curve and we operate at maximal efficiency, or we're best active at a medium state of arousal. People perform best when they are markedly aroused with emotion. Representativeness heuristic is kind of like stereotyping, so we tend to classify people and objects based on a given prototype, which is basically stereotyping. Noah Chomsky says that children are born with the ability to learn language from the start. Babies are born with something called a language attenuation device, or LED, that allows them to learn language a lot easier and quicker than most adult humans. 2 components of the sensory memory register: the iconic component, which is what we see and lasts half a second, and the echoic component, which is what we hear and lasts 3 to 4 seconds. The 5 sensory adaptation are vision, hearing, touch, sense. Vision, hearing, touch, vision, touch, sense, hearing, proprioception. Vision, touch. Okay. Proactive coping. This is knowing that there is a challenging event coming up and finding ways to prepare how to cope with it. Conduction aphasia, inability to. It means there's a problem with the accruent fasciculus, which makes it impossible to coordinate hearing and speaking activities. Rhodopsin. So rhodopsin is a protein located in rods, and when light hits the rods, some of the light will hit the rhodopsin molecule, and retinol, which is another molecule inside rhodopsin, will change shape from bent to straight. If you destroy both sides of your amygdala, it causes Kluver-Bucy syndrome, which causes hyperality, hypersexuality, and disinhibited behavior, which is just not thinking about your actions or consequences of your action. Parallel processing is processing color, form, motion all at the same time. Main symptom of depression is anhedonia, which is the inability to experience pleasure, so you perceive more stressors. Hans-Sells general adaptation syndrome. It states that we have there's 3 stages of stress. So there's the alert phase, or the alarm phase, the resistance phase, and the exhaustion phase. What is a dual coding? It says that it's easier to learn words with the word itself and the image rather than each one alone. Which 2 are the hippocampus and the frontal cortex. Biological reason for depression is the anterior cingulate, which is the anterior part of the frontal cortex, will stop responding to serotonin. It's when the anterior cingulate, the anterior part of the frontal cortex, will stop responding to serotonin. Which four region of the brain does VTA send dopamine to? Dopamine sent to the amygdala, nucleus accumbens, prefrontal cortex, and hippocampus. The PANA. VTA PANA are involved in traveling. VTA sends dopamine to the amygdala, nucleus accumbens, prefrontal cortex, and hippocampus. Now the hypothalamus, the hippocampus. Salutations bind directly to the salt receptors, and salutations bind to the sour receptors, which triggers them to be more reactive to the protons, and binding of protons will decrease, like, phosphate or something. Potassium channels. Sour tastings bind to sourness receptors, which react with H+, and once H+ binds to the receptors, it closes the potassium channels. What structure separates the olfactory epithelium from the brain? The cribriform plate. Nicotine acts on adenosine receptor. Acts on acetylcholine receptors. VTA releases dopamine to parts of the brain, specifically have dopamine reuptake carriers. What do each of these parts do when they receive dopamine? Amygdala controls emotion. For the other ones, controls tells you that you're very happy. Remembers environment, so we can do it again. The hippocampus remembers environment. Nucleus accumbens controls motor function, and prefrontal cortex focuses your attention. Prefrontal cortex is focusing your attention. Nucleus accumbens controls your motor function. Hippocampus remembers the environment, and amygdala controls emotion. Posterior chamber. Area behind the iris filled with aqueous humor. Area behind the iris, and it's filled with aqueous humor. Area behind the iris. Which cortex receives info from the cochlea? Primary auditory cortex, which is part of the temporal lobe. Social coping. Seeking social support from others as a way to cope with stress. What does the visual spatial sketchpad process? The visual spatial sketchpad, visual and spatial information, obviously. Phonologic loop processes variable info and numbers into iconic and echoic memory. Visual spatial information is what the visual spatial sketchpad processes. And the phonological loop processes variable info and numbers into iconic and echoic memory. Which of the senses are considered to be ipsilateral, which are contralateral? So ipsilateral is olfaction and gustation, which is smell and taste, is our ipsilateral, while vision, hearing, and touch is contralateral. Okay, that makes sense. Olfaction and gustation are ipsilateral, while vision, hearing, touch is contralateral. Source of amnesia. Inability to remember where or how you previously learned information has been acquired while retaining the factual knowledge. Source means you still have the source, you still have the factual knowledge, but you're not able to remember where you learned that information. It's an inability to remember where, when, or how previously learned information has been acquired or retained the factual knowledge. What are the damaging effects of stress on our metabolism? During stress, body secretes cortisol and glucagon. Glucagon will cause glycogen to release glucose, which will cause an increase in blood sugar. During stress, body secretes cortisol and glucagon. Glucagon causes glycogen to release glucose, which will cause increased blood sugar. Empty card. People with sleep depression tend to be more irritable, have poor memory and attention, and are prone to obesity. 3 ways to cope with stress. Perceive control, optimism, and social support. Perceive control, optimism, social support. Pose. Perceive control, optimism, social support. Pheromones, things that bind to chemical signals that can be sensed by other animals through the nose. This will elicit a response in the animal smell. A chemical signal that can be sensed by other animals through the nose. This will elicit a response in the animal smelling it. Autobiographical memory. Memory system consisting of episodes recollected from an individual's life based on episodic and semantic memory. Memory system consisting of episodes recollected from an individual's life based on episodic and semantic memory. Memory system consisting of episodes recollected from an individual's life based on episodic and semantic memory. Memory system consisting of episodes recollected from an individual's life. Memory system consisting of episodes recollected from based on episodic and semantic memory. B.F. Skinner theory of language maintains that children learn language through operant conditioning. So they learn language based on positive reinforcement. Pierre got stages of cognitive 7 to 11 years. I forgot which one. Concrete operational stage. Children learn the idea of conservation. Children learn to reason mathematics and understand pouring a glass of water means the same thing. Mathematics and conservation in its concrete operational stage. What effects do benzodiazepines have and what's it used for? Benzodiazepines are used as sleep aid or anti-anxiety seizure. Binds to GABA receptors to make your brain's response to GABA enhance by opening up GABA-activated chloride channels to make neurons more negatively charged. Binds to GABA receptors to make your brain's response to GABA enhance by opening up chloride channels to make the neuron more negatively charged. Depressant. A sleep aid or anti-anxiety drug binds to GABA receptors to make your brain's response to GABA enhance by opening GABA-activated chloride channels to make neurons more negatively charged. Trestman's attenuation theory states that we have an attenuator that decreases input from the unattended ear. So we go sensory register, attenuator, perceptual process, and unconscious. The basal forebrain, collection of structures located near the striatum, including the nucleus accumbens, nucleus bacillus, and medial septonuclei, which is all important for the production of acetylcholine, which is required for orienting attention. Collection of structures located near the striatum includes nucleus bacillus, nucleus accumbens, and medial septonuclei, all important for production of acetylcholine, which is required for orienting attention. 4 visual cues. Depth, form, motion, constancy. What effects do barbiturates have and what's it used for? Depresses your CNS, used to induce sleep or reduce anxiety. Barbiturates depress your central nervous system and induces sleep or reduces anxiety. What happens when the retinal changes conformation? When the retinal changes conformation, from bent to straight, this causes rhodopsin to change shape, which initiates a photosynthetic cascade. Encoding mean in term, bring something from long-term memory to short-term memory to long-term memory. Or circadian rhythm, naturally controlled by melatonin. Pineal gland. Regular body rhythms across a 24-hour period. Melatonin controls the circadian rhythm of the pineal gland. Yerkes also says that people perform best when they are moderately aroused with emotion. Participant is an ideal observer. Participant is a conservative observer. Conservative liberal. THC increases dopamine and GABA activity. Increases dopamine and GABA activity. What is the path of sound in the human ear? Pinna, which is the outer ear auditory canal, then tympanic membrane, which is the eardrum. Pinna, the outer ear, auditory canal, and tympanic membrane. When light hits rod, it is turned off. This will activate the off-center bipolar cells and inactivate the off-center bipolar cells and activate the on-center bipolar cells. Resistance phase. Fleeing, huddling, temperature elevation, high cortisol. Fleeing, huddling, temperature elevation, high cortisol. Fleeing, huddling, temperature elevation, high cortisol. 16 emotions, termed by Paul Ekman. Happiness, sadness, fear, surprise, disgust, anger. Happiness, sadness, fear, surprise, disgust, anger. Happiness, sadness, fear, surprise, disgust, anger. By Paul Ekman. What is the biological reason for depression? There's a problem with your anterior cingulate, which is... serotonin. Anterior cingulate, which is the anterior part of the frontal cortex, will stop responding to serotonin. The 4 regions of the brain that VTA sends dopamine to is the prefrontal cortex, amygdala, nucleus accumbens, hippocampus. Hippocampus, nucleus accumbens, amygdala. What happens when the basilar membrane and the organ cordy move? Hair cells are brushed up against the tectorial membrane, causing an action potential. When the basilar membrane and the organ of cordy move, hair cells are brushed up against the tectorial membrane, causing an action potential. Salty tastings can bind directly to salt receptors. Sour tastings bind to sour receptor, which makes them reactive to protons. So when protons bind to sour receptor, they close potassium channels. What structure separates the olfactory epithelium in the brain? What structure separates the olfactory cribriform plate? Nicotine will act on acetylcholine receptors. Sigmund Freud theory states that dreams are unconscious thoughts and desires that need to be interpreted. Dreams are to remember when they're happening in REM. Dreams are in REM sleep. Brainwaves look like they are completely awake. Pragmatics. Dependence on language, on context, and pre-existing knowledge. Negative priming and positive priming. Negative priming slows down reaction to a stimulus based on prior exposure. Positive priming speeds up reaction to stimulus based on prior exposure. Amygdala controls your emotions, so it makes you happy. Hippocampus remembers where you did it, so you can do it again. Nuclear accumbens is involved in motor function, so I'll tell you to do it again. And prefrontal cortex involved in focusing, so focus your attention. Posterior chamber is behind the iris and contains aqueous humor. Which cortex receives info from the cochlea? Primary auditory cortex, which is under the temporal lobe. Social coping is dealing with having friends over and socializing with friends to cope with stress. Operational span testing, a test in which subjects are asked to perform mathematical verification and read a word. Maximum words they can be recalled in the operation span. A task in which subjects are asked to perform a mathematical verification and they read a word, and then they will recite words, a maximum number of words that can be recalled, and that's the operation span. What does visual spatial sketchback process? Visual spatial info phonological loop process verbal info and numbers into iconic and echoic memory. Darwin think that emotion is our ability to understand and express emotion is an innate ability that gives us a better chance of survival. Our ability to understand and express emotion as an innate ability allows us to act and gave us a better chance of survival. Which of the senses are considered to be gustation and olfaction are ipsilateral? Vision, hearing, touch is contralateral. First, amnesia is not being able to remember where you got the information from while retaining factual knowledge. If the oval window gets vibrated, it pushes fluid and causes it to go around cochlea, around structure line wood hair. So it pushes fluid and causes it to go around cochlea, which is around structure line wood hair cells. What are damaging effects of stress on metabolism? So when we're stressed, we secrete cortisol and glucagon will tell glycogen to release glucose into blood cells, increasing blood sugar. During N1 sleep stage, we go through dominated by theta waves. Dominated by theta waves. Hypnagogic hallucination, seeing, hearing things that aren't there. Hypnic jerks, just twitching. What happens during the N1 sleep stage? Theta waves, hypnagogic hallucination, seeing, hypnic jerks, muscle twitching. Alpha, beta, theta, delta. Theta waves, hypnagogic hallucination, seeing, hearing things aren't there, and hypnic jerk, which is muscle twitching. The waves of cope with stress are optimism, social coping, and perceived control. Perceived control, optimism, and social coping. Perceived control, optimism, social support. What are pheromones? These are chemicals that can be detected by animals and allow them to elicit a response. Rods are normally turned on. When light hits rod, they turn off. Light hits, it turns off rod, turning on bipolar cells, retinal ganglions, which allow air to send signal to the brain. All biographical memory are a collection of episodic and semantic memories, episodes of one life, based on episodic and semantic memory. What is amplification in terms of light hitting photoreceptors? Light will hit photoreceptors in the eye, which causes other cells to fire, and cells keep firing until it's amplified. 17th is called the concrete operational stage, and it's defined as children being able to know the idea of conservation, where you're pouring water from one cup to another cup means you pour the same amount of water, or they both have the same amount of water, and mathematical reasoning. Absolute threshold of sensation. Minimum intensity of a stimulus needed to detect a particular stimulus 50% of the time. Minimum intensity of a stimulus needed to detect a particular stimulus 50% of the time. Minimum intensity of stimulus needed to detect a particular stimulus 50% of the time. Benzodiazepines they lower your central nervous system, and they're used for sleep aid and reducing anxiety. And they lower GABA receptors, or they act on GABA receptors by binding GABA receptors and allowing them to increase their uptake of chloride, or they activate GABA chloride channels, which causes chloride to influx into the cell, causing it to be more negatively charged. Cool. LSD modifies serotonin neurotransmission, especially at the 5-HT2 receptor family, and dilates the pupil, which is called mydriasis. Mydriasis. It modifies serotonin neurotransmission, especially at the 5-HT2 receptor. Dilates the pupil, which is mydriasis. Basal forebrain is a collection of structures located near the striatum, including the nucleus bacillus, nucleus accumbens, and nucleus septal nuclei, and it's responsible for the production of acetylcholine, which is important for orienting attention. 4 visual cues are color, form, motion, constancy. Depth, form, motion, constancy. What effects do barbiturates have? They depress your CNS, and they're used for sleep aid and anti-anxiety drugs. What does encoding mean in terms of memory? Bringing things from short-term memory, working memory, into long-term memory. What is circadian? Natural rhythm the body goes through in a 24-hour period. The main chemical that controls the circadian rhythm is the melatonin hormone, and it's secreted from the pineal gland. Endogenous cues require internal knowledge to understand the cue and intentions to follow it. Driven by top-down processing. Requires internal knowledge to understand the cue and the intention to follow it. Driven by top-down processing. Requires internal knowledge to understand the cue and intention to follow it. Driven by top-down processing. C equals 0 is ideal, C below 1 is liberal, C above 1 is conservative observer. THC activates dopamine and activates GABA. Pathosonium goes from the pinna, which is outer ear, to the pinna, to the tympanic membrane. Auditory canal. Pinna, outer ear, auditory canal, tympanic membrane, eardrum. When light hits rod, it is turned off. This will activate the polar cells, which activates inactivate. Oh, this will activate the on-center bipolar cells, which activate the off-center bipolar cells. Resistance faces fleeing and huddling, and temperature elevation and high levels of cortisol. 6 universal emotion coined by Paul: happiness, sadness, fear, anger, disgust, surprise. Man, I'm good today. Explicit memory can be divided into declarative facts that you can. Explicit memory are declarative facts that you can explicitly describe and can be divided into episodic and semantic memory. Facts and events that you can explicitly describe can be divided into episodic and semantic memories. Declarative facts, events that you can explicitly describe and can be divided into episodic and semantic memory. Low effort syndrome. Oh, I remember this one. Coping response of minority groups in order to fit into a dominant culture. Minority students may learn to put in minimal effort because they believe that they are being discriminated against by dominant cultures. I don't really understand that, but I memorized it, so that's good. Coping response. Coping response of minority groups in an attempt to fit into dominant. For example, minority groups may learn to put in minimal effort because they believe that being discriminated against by dominant cultures. When basilar membrane and cord moves, it pushes hair cells against a tectorial membrane, causing action potential. Biological reason for depression is due to the anterior cingulate being unable to detect serotonin. Cool. Sigmund Freud theory says that dreams are unconscious thoughts and desires that need to be interpreted. Dreams are considered to be memorable when they happen in REM sleep, and these brainwaves look like they're wide awake. Pragmatics are the dependence of a language on prior knowledge, context. Negative priming is the slowing down of a response to a stimulus based on prior exposure, and positive priming is the speeding up of a response to a stimulus based on prior exposure. Constancy. Our perception of objects don't change even if it looks different on the retina. Size constancy, shape constancy, color constancy. Our perception of objects don't change even if it looks different on the retina. Size, shape, color constancy. Encoding specificity. Theories that you get enhanced memory when taking tests under the same condition as learning. What is the prefrontal cortex responsible for? Attention. Executive control, problem decision making, how you act in social situations. Executive control, problem decision making, and how you act in social situations. Right from the left visual field, we'll hit the nasal side of the left eye. Hit the nasal side. So nasal side same, temporal side opposite. Right visual field, hit the nasal side of the right eye, temporal side left eye. What is operational span testing? So this is where you get the subjects a math problem, ask them to solve math problem. Then you give them a list of words to remember, and then they recite the words. And the number of words they can recite is called the operational span. What are the 3 factors that influence our ability to multitask? Task similarity, task difficulty, and practice. How similar the task is, task difficulty, and practice. What did Darwin think about emotion? He thought that emotion was an innate ability, and that the ability to understand and express emotion conferred a survival advantage to us as a species. The longer distance between nodes, or more nodes in between, the less related the concepts are. The longer it takes to verify the connection. Decay in human memory causes forgetting. When we don't encode something or don't retrieve for a while, we don't recall it anymore. Pathway between the cue and memory becomes weaker over time, which makes it harder to stimulate those neurons. Causes forgetting. When we don't encode something for a while, we don't recall it anymore. Pathway between cue and memory becomes weaker over time, which makes it harder to stimulate those neurons. What happens when the over and over get fired? It pushes fluid in and around the cochlea, which pulls on hair cells to reaction potential. What is the just notable difference? Threshold at which you're able to notice a change in sensation. The just notable difference is the threshold at which you're able to notice a change in any sensation. Describe the endocrine response to stress. No idea. Adrenal medulla releases catecholamine hormones such as adrenaline and noradrenaline, while adrenal cortex releases glucocorticoids such as cortisol. So the adrenal medulla releases catecholamine hormones such as adrenaline and noradrenaline. Adrenal cortex, the adrenal medulla and adrenal cortex releases glucocorticoids called cortisol. That's kind of hard to remember. During the N1 sleep state is dominated by theta waves, contains hypnagogic hallucination and hypnagogic hallucination signaling are not there. Hypnic jerks is random twitching, dominated by theta waves. The mesocorpus strip is optimism, social support, and perceived control. Broca's aphasia is when Broca's area is damaged so people have trouble producing speech. Wernicke aphasia is where the words damage to the Wernicke's area, so the words they speak out don't make sense and they don't understand what people say. The words they speak out don't make sense and they don't understand what people say. Rods are normally turned off when light hits the rod. Rods will turn on, which activates bipolar cells, which activates retinal ganglion cells, which trigger the optic nerve to send signal to a brain. Two types of cones: red, green, blue. Amplification is when light hits the photoreceptors and they get amplified by the time they get to the brain. 5 ways you manage stress: exercise, meditation, religion, cognitive flexibility, and coping. What are 5 ways we can manage stress? Exercise, meditation, religious, cognitive flexibility, and coping. All About for Memory is episodes of one's life controlled by episodic memory and sympathetic memory, which make up explicit memory. Conjunction fallacy comes from representative heuristic way of thinking. When people think co-occurs in the two instances, more likely to be a feminist big teller than just a big teller alone. Comes from representativeness heuristic way of thinking. Absolute threshold sensation is the minimum amount of sensation in order to detect a stimulus 50% of the time. So we have tasks to retrieve information. Priming, the prior activation of nodes. Context, the environment, which you couldn't say depend the mood, which you priming, prior activations, context, the environment, code memory, and state dependence, mood, which you priming, which is the prior activation node. Context, which is the location you learn the stuff in, and state dependent, which is the state you're in when you're doing learning. So, present, absent, yes, no. If signal is present, you respond yes, that's a hit. If signal is absent and you respond yes, that's a false alarm. If signal is present and you respond no, it's a miss. If signal is absent and you respond no, it's a correct rejection. LSD will inhibit serotonin neurotransmission, especially at the 5-HT2 receptor family, and it dilates the pupil, which is myodrasis. What are sleep syndrome and N2 sleep stage? So in N2 sleep stage, they both start to keep you asleep. Sleep syndrome is random bursts of rapid brain activity and K complexes suppress cortical arousal and cortical arousal and memory consolidation. Two substrate both try to keep you asleep. Rapid sleep signals, rapid complexes suppress cortical arousal, memory consolidation. Pediatrics claim that all of this included in trying to understand the world as using schemas. Semantics. Association of meanings of words. Where do all information body end up in the brain? Semasitic cortex of the parietal lobe. How do endogenous cues play a role in our attention? Endogenous cues requires internal knowledge to understand the cue and the intention to follow it. Exogenous cues requires internal knowledge to understand the cue and the intention driven by top-down processing. What effects do benzodiazepines have? So benzodiazepines depress your central nervous system, and they amplify your brain's response to GABA. So they enhance GABA receptors by binding to GABA receptor chloride channels, which influxes chloride ions into the neuron, which makes them more negatively charged. What are deaf-form motion constancy? The amygdala, emotion, aggression, mating, which is involved in temporal lobe, which is involved in memory decision. Emotion, aggression, mating, but in temporal lobe is involved in memory decision making. Involving emotion, aggression, mating, emotion, aggression, temporal lobe, memory decision making. Autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic, parasympathetic is just sympathetic nervous system is fight flight. Parasympathetic is rest and digest. Explicit memory is declarative, and they can be divided into episodic and semantic memories. They are facts and events that can explicitly describe. What effects do barbiturates? They oppress your CNS and are used to induce sleep and reduce anxiety. What's passive? It goes from the pinna outer ear to the auditory canal to the tympanic membrane, which is the eardrum. Olfactory bulb. Bundle of nerves that send little projections through the cribriform plate into the olfactory epithelium. Olfactory bulb. A bundle of nerves that sends little projections through the cribriform plate into the olfactory epithelium. Bundle of nerves that sends little projections through the cribriform plate into the olfactory epithelium. Low effort syndrome is a coping mechanism minority uses to fit into dominant cultures. So this is, for example, where low minority groups will put in little effort because they know they'll be discriminated by dominant cultures anyway. This is due to something called the anterior cingulate, which is located in the anterior part of the prefrontal cortex. It's called like the accruing cingulate. But basically, stops responding to serotonin. Anterior cingulate. Anterior part of the prefrontal cortex stops responding to serotonin. Alcohol, decreased inhibition, decreased cognitive control, lack of coordination, disruption of REM sleep, which is a formation of memory. Decreased inhibition, decreased cognitive control, lack of coordination, disruption of REM sleep. Decreased inhibition, decreased cognitive control, lack of coordination, disruption of REM sleep, which is involved in the formation of memory. Constancy is seeing something that perceiving to look different, even though it looks different than our retina. Size constancy, color constancy, shape constancy. Color constancy, size. Cool. We have enhanced memory when we take a test, for example, in the place where we did the learning. Prefrontal cortex is responsible for decision making, how you act in social situations, and executive control. Ray of light from the left visual field hits the nasal side of the left eye and hits the temporal side of the right eye. Ray of light from the right visual field will hit the nasal side on the right eye and hits the temporal side on the left eye. What happens when the tip links get pushed back and forth by the end-lift movements? They stretch and allow the potassium to flow into the cell from the potassium-rich epithelial end-lift. This activates calcium channels to flow calcium into which causes action potential. So tip link stretch and allows the K-pus to flow into the cell from the endolith, which is rich in potassium. This activates calcium channels, which to flow calcium in, which causes action potentials. Practice, test similarity, and test difficulty, test similarity, and practice. The longer distance, the longer it takes to verify connection. The longer distance between nodes or no nodes in between, the longer it takes to verify connection. Decay in human memory is where when we don't encode something to our memory for a very long time, the connection between the cue and memory starts to degrade, which causes forgetting. Just a notable difference is the minimum amount of intensity of a stimulus required to detect any change in stimulation. Exhaustion. Our body's force is depleted and our tissues are damaged, which is involved in negative impact on long-term stress. Our bodies are equipped to long-term. Body stress response are depleted and our tissues become damaged. Negative impact on long-term stress because we're not equipped to handle long-term stress. The endocrine response to stress. Endocrine was the adrenal medulla will secrete acetylcholine, or will secrete adrenaline and noradrenaline, and the adrenal cortex will secrete cortisol. Cortex, cortisol. I'm going to do it again. Describe the process when glucose hit the tongue. Glucose will bind to G-protein coupled receptors on a sweet cell, causing G-protein to dissociate and opening up ion channels. This will depolarize the cell and travel down the axon to the brain. Glucose will bind G-protein coupled receptors on sweet cells, causing G-protein to dissociate and opening up ion channels, thus depolarizing the cell. Glucose will bind to G-protein coupled receptors. G-protein to dissociate and opening up ion channels, which causes the cell to depolarize and sending axon to the brain, which is the posterior cortex. Broca's aphasia is when there's a problem with Broca's area in the brain, and this causes issues with speech production. Wernicke's aphasia is when there's a problem with Wernicke's area, which causes a problem with understanding speech. So this is where they're spitting out words that don't really make sense, and they're unable to understand other sentences that people are saying. Red, green, blue. We can manage stress by religion, coping, coping, exercise, flexibility, cognitive flexibility, and meditation. Conjunction fallacy is where the idea where we typically tend to believe the co-occurrence of two events rather than one is driven by a representative heuristic way of thinking. For example, you tend to believe there is a feminist bank teller rather than just a bank teller alone. Intoxication withdrawal. Intoxication is a behavioral and psychological effect of a person behavioral and psychological effect of a person when he or she takes a specific drug. Withdrawal is when you stop taking drug after a prolonged time. Behavioral and psychological effects of a person when he or she takes a specific drug. What are the three things that would influence one's ability to retrieve information? Priming, state dependence, and context. So priming is having a prior response to prior exposure to allow a faster response. Context is the context which you encode memory in, and what did I just say? Priming, context, and just forgot it. Priming, context, and working to influence one ability to retrieve information. Priming, context, and state dependence. If you're drunk, you're able to remember better. Or if you learn something when you're drunk, when you get drunk again, you'll be able to remember it better. Signal detection theory. So, hit, miss, or signal, and then your response. If there's a signal and you say yes, that's a hit. If there's no signal and you say yes, that's a false alarm. If there is a signal and you say no, that's a miss. If there's no signal and you say no, that's a false rejection. Or correct rejection. Crap. Sleep spindles and K complex are involved in N2 sleep stage, and they all keep you asleep. Sleep spindles are rapid bursts of brain activity, while K complexes will suppress cortical arousal and memory consolidation. Pythagoras schemas always include the to understand the world using schemas. Semantics are the way words are. Semantics are the associated meaning with words. Where do all information in the body end up in the brain? So, sensory cortex at the parietal lobe. Information processing model of memory. Our brains are very similar. We input, processing, and output decision. Brains are similar to a computer. We input, process, output decision. Iris is gives the eye color, constricts, relaxes, changes size of pupil. Lower central nervous system, we have benzodiazepine, barbiturates, and alcohol. Process of working memory occurs at the sensory register, the visual, spatial, sketch pattern, and phonologic loop. What is the amygdala involved in? Aggression, mating, and emotion. And the temporal lobes involved in decision making. What are the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system? We have the parasympathetic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system, or parasympathetic and sympathetic. Sympathetic is fight or flight, parasympathetic is rest and digest. How do endogenous cues play a role? Endogenous cues are intrinsic cues, so they're built up by top-down processing. Like, for example, a mouse, you have to understand that a mouse isn't really a mouse, it's a computer mouse. Requires internal knowledge to understand it. Requires internal knowledge to understand the cue and intentions driven on by top-down processing. Olfactory bulb is a collection of bundle of nerves that sends projection down the cribriform plate into the olfactory epithelium. Object permanence. Pre-operational speech is when children develop or engage in pretend play and use symbols to represent things. They learn to use words to symbolize objects. Kids are very self-centered and egocentric. 2 to 7-year-old is a pre-operational speech. This is when children engage in pretend play, uses symbols to represent things, and to use words. For example, words to symbolize objects. They're self-centered and egocentric. What is explicit memory? Explicit memory is memory that are declarative facts and events that you can explicitly talk about, divided into semantic and episodic memory. A-beta fibers are the fastest fibers available. They have lots of myelinated sheets, and they have large diameter axons. People who regularly go into deep meditation shows an increased activity in which three parts of the brain. Prefrontal cortex, right hippocampus, right anterior insula. Prefrontal cortex, right hippocampus, and anterior insula. What affects the alcohol? They decrease inhibition, decrease coordination, and a disruption of REM sleep, which is involved in the formation of memories. Dementia. Decline memory and cognitive interfering daily results from damage to brain tissue from something like a stroke. Decline in memory and cognitive function, where it interferes with daily life, results from damage to brain tissue from something like a stroke. Which nerve fiber connects Wernicke's and Broca's area? I believe it's the acroon fasciculus? The acroot fasciculus, which is also found in deaf people who know sign language. Yes! I already got it. You got it? Yeah, right here. Yes. The acroot fasciculus. Which nerve fiber connects Wernicke's and Broca? The acroot fasciculus, which is also found in deaf people who know sign language. Which nerve fiber connects Wernicke's and Broca's area? The acroot fasciculus, which is also found in deaf people who know sign language. Cool. What is constancy? It's the appearance, the perceivance of an image that's different than what we see on our retina. There's size constancy, shape constancy, and color constancy. What happens when tip links get pushed back and forth? So endolives contain lots of potassium K pluses. So when endolives, tip links push back the endolives will have potassium that flow into the tip links, which also causes the influx of calcium ions to trigger calcium, which causes which opens up calcium receptors to allow the influx of calcium ions, which allows for action potentials to fire. Biological reason for deficient is coming from the anterior cingulate, which is in the anterior part of the prefrontal cortex, and this stops responding to serotonin. What is orienting attention? Driven by acetylcholine. Capacity to change focus from attention from one stimulus to another stimulus, modulated by acetylcholine produced in the basal forebrain. Capacity to change focus of attention from one stimulus to another stimulus, modulated by acetylcholine produced in the basal forebrain. Okay, mẹ, I'm studying. What? Just be quiet, mẹ ơi. Close the door. Shut up. Quiet. What are stimulants? Stimulants are things that increase your central nervous system. Vasoconstrictor. Vasoconstrictor incite your central nervous system, increasing your heart rate and alertness. Exhaustion phase is when your body is depleted of sources for stress, of resources that deals with stress, and where our bodies are not equipped to deal with long-term stress, so our tissues begin to get damaged. That's right. So beta looks like we're awake. Alpha is, I forgot. Highest frequency, lowest frequency, longest wavelength. Highest frequency, so shortest wavelength. Medium frequency, low frequency, lowest frequency. Daydreaming state. So awakeness, highest frequency. Daydream state, medium frequency. Theta waves, drowsiness, low frequency, lowest frequency. Deep sleep, drowsiness, daydream state, awakeness. Glucose hit the tongues, it binds to G protein couple receptor, which causes G protein to dissociate, and then that allows for the activation of ion channels, which causes ions to flow into the cell, depolarizing the cell, and sending an synapse or sending an action potentials to the brain. So on our heart, increased blood pressure, maybe from the glucose. I don't know. Causes hypertension and vascular disease, such as coronary heart disease. Increased blood pressure can cause hypertension and vascular disease, such as coronary heart disease. Okay, increased blood pressure can cause hypertension and vascular disease, coronary heart disease. Why do things? Because the prefrontal cortex stops working. This is one for logic. Endocrine response, so the adrenal cortex will secrete glucocorticoids known as cortisols, while the adrenal medulla will secrete adenocholamines such as adrenaline and noradrenaline. Cool. Sleep apnea is the inability to fall asleep. Oh, stop breathing while sleeping, body will wake up to gasp for air. Stop breathing while sleeping, body will wake up to gasp for air while falling back to sleep without utilizing it. Intoxication is the behavioral and psychological effects of taking a drug. Withdrawal is getting away from a drug for a long period of time. 3 types of intelligence proposed by Robert Sternberg. Analytical intelligence, creative intelligence, and practical intelligence. Generating novel ideas. So the 3 types of intelligence are proposed by Robert Sternberg. Analytical intelligence, which is our academic ability. Creative intelligence, which is our ability to adapt to new situations. And practical intelligence is solving ill-defined problems. Filiform papillae is a structure that exists all over the tongue, contains no taste buds. Okay, especially at the center of the tongue. It exists all over the tongue, especially at the center of the tongue, but does not contain taste buds. That's filiform papillae. No idea. External outer ears defined by the pinna to the tympanic membrane, middle ears from the mouth to the stapes, which is make up the 3 ossicles, and the inner ears, the cochlea, and the semicircular canals. External outer ear, pinna to the tympanic membrane, malleus to the stapes, which make up the 3 ossicles, and cochlea to the semicircular canal. Pinna to tympanic membrane to make up the external. Middle ears from the malleus to the stapes, mesosupe, malleus, incus, stapes, make up the 3 ossicles. Cochlea and semicircular canals make up the inner ear. What are 5 ways exercise, meditation, coping, cognitive flexibility, and exercise, meditation, social coping, cognitive flexibility, religion. Kind of knew that. I'll do it again. What are group meetings used for in the drug world? 12-step program that helps people go through recovery, acceptance, surrender, ASA. Acceptance, which you acknowledge, surrender, which you accept help offered, and helping other acts. 12-step program people go through recovery, acceptance, where you acknowledge your addiction, surrender, where you accept help offered, and active involvement is helping other addicts. Semantics are how the association of meanings to words. Information processing model of memory. Processing model of memory. Our brains are like computers. We get input, process, output. Irises are basically give our eyes color and constrict and dilate to change the size of the pupil. Depressants decrease your central nervous system. 3 types are benzodiazepines, barbiturates, and alcohol. Lower central nervous system. Processing of working memory occurs at the phonological loop and the visual spatial sketchpad. Retroactive I remember this one. This one's hard. Retroactive interference, new learning impairs old info, while proactive interference is old learning impairs new info. New learning impairs old info. Writing new address makes it difficult to recall old address. Proactive is hard for you to remember a new password when you've been using an old password for so long. That's why it's hard to retrieve memory sometimes. Retroactive interference, new learning. Interfering with the old stuff. Interfering with the new stuff. Okay. What is linguistic universal theory? Characteristics that remain constant across all languages of different cultures. Linguistic universal theory. Characteristics that remain consistent across all languages of different cultures. What is the amygdala involved in? Aggression, mating, and emotion. Involved in emotion, aggression, and mating. And temporal lobe is involved in decision making and memory consolidation. 2 to 7 years is called the pre-operational stage. This is where people engage in pretend play. Children engage in pretend play to use objects or symbols to symbolize objects. And they're egocentric and self-centered. Fastest fiber, lots of myelin sheet, large diameter. Endogenous cues are cues that require internal knowledge in order to process it, driven by top-down processing. For example, a mouse requires you to use internal ideas of a mouse in order to perceive what it actually is. Increase in right hippocampus, right anterior insula, and prefrontal cortex. People who go into deep meditation show an increase in right prefrontal hippocampus or anterior insula. Place theory, no idea. Our perception of sound depends on where each component of frequency produces vibration along a basilar membrane. Higher tones produce higher and lower tones in a specific area of the cochlea basilar membrane. Our perception depends on where each frequency produces vibration along the basilar membrane. So higher tones and lower tones excite specific areas. What is dementia? This is where there are issues with your cognitive functions that impair daily life. Typically arises when the tissues get damaged from something like a stroke. A fiber or A delta fiber, A beta is the fastest, and we go A delta and then C fibers. A beta is the fastest, A delta, C fibers. Oh shit, whatever. Which nerve fiber connects Wernicke's area? The accruent fasciculus connects both areas and is also seen in deaf people. Oh shoot. What is decision making in terms of psychology? Going from no goal to end goal. Making a judgment of desirability or probability of a certain outcome. Dissociation theory of hypnosis, social influence theory. Hypnotism is dissociation theory of hypnosis. So dissociation theory says that hypnotism is an extreme form of divided consciousness. Social influence theory people do and report what's expected of them. For example, like actors caught in the role and believing you are a lizard. Hypnotism is an extreme form of divided consciousness, and social influence is that people do what's expected, for example, actor caught up in their role or a person telling you you're a lizard and then you believe you're a lizard. The first stage, the appraisal theory of stress, has two stages to the cognitive stage of stress. The first stage is a primary appraisal, which is blank, which is assessing the stress in its present situation. It's either irrelevant, benign, positive, or stressful or negative. Assessing the stress in its present situation is either irrelevant, benign, positive, or stressful or negative. It's either irrelevant, benign, or positive, or stressful or negative. That's 200 cards. Take a break, and we'll be back later.